All right, I think we'll get started. Good morning. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute, and what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion about the present and future of the American economy. I'm Jim Pethokoukis, and our event today is titled "The Great American Stagnation or Acceleration." I love this topic for a number of reasons, one of which is I get to quote Paul Krugman, who said the following about what raises living standards. And by the way, in every conference about productivity, this quote must be said, so I will say it. I do not want to violate any rules. Productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. Unfortunately, government statisticians have a gloomy take on productivity these days. Over the past 5 years, according to official statistics, productivity growth has averaged just 0.6% annually. The historical average is about 2.2% from 1947 through 2014, and productivity growth this year is likely to be under 1%. Indeed, productivity growth has slowed since the early 1970s, except for a brief surge between the mid-1990s and the mid-2000s. This multi-decade downshift has been called the Great Stagnation. Now remember, slower productivity growth results in an economy with less potential for economic growth, and that could be a warning sign that innovation is decelerating as well. Northwestern University's Robert Gordon has received considerable attention for his paper, Is U.S. Economic Growth Over?, in which he argues that today's innovations will have far less impact on productivity than past innovations such as electricity, the internal combustion engine, and public sanitation. And the quote from his paper, "The rapid progress made over the past 250 years could well turn out to be a unique episode in human history." But is that right? What if things are actually a lot better than we think? Or at least better than current productivity and GDP figures suggest? Think about it. Month after month, the economy is generating nearly 250,000 net new jobs. The unemployment rate is close to 5%. Corporate profit margins are high, but stock value is not far behind. And Silicon Valley is on fire. One analysis finds the number of unicorns, technology startups valued at more than $1 billion, has more than doubled since 2013. Europe would love to have a stagnant economy like America's. And certainly many Silicon Valley technologists, entrepreneurs, and investors say the official numbers are really understating just how productive and innovative the U.S. economy is. For instance, Google chief economist Hal Varian argues that economic growth and productivity are understated because government statistics are not able to properly measure the value of many innovations, especially in the digital economy. And in their book, The Second Machine Age, MIT's Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee argue that today's digital technologies are only just now beginning to fundamentally transform the American economy. As they write, "We are living in a time of astonishing progress with digital technologies, those that have computer hardware, software, and networks at their core. But just as it took generations to improve the steam engine to the point that it could power the Industrial Revolution, it's also taken time to refine our digital engines." So a lot of questions here. Are we actually doing better than we think? If so, why do so many Americans feel the economy is so bad? If we really are doing okay, can we do even better? Then again, if we're stuck in a great stagnation, might it only be temporary? Oh, and what about workers? How do we explain the paradox of worrying about declining productivity and innovation at the very same time we're worried about robots and algorithms taking all our jobs? To those questions and more, we've assembled an all-star panel. You have their bios, so I'm going to keep the introductions brief, and we're just going to go down the line here. We have economist and author James Besson from Boston University School of Law. We have John Fernald, Senior Research Advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. We have Michael Feroli, Chief U.S. Economist at J.P. Morgan. And we have Stephen Allnar, who's a resident scholar here at AEI after spending more than 25 years at the Federal Reserve Board. So I think we'll start with James and move right on down the road.
Hi, okay. Well...
All right. Well, there was 100. So apparently we need more innovation.
Stagnation or innovation?
You just
Is it not?
do the right arrow. I'm doing the right arrow? Left
Right
arrow?
there. Could we send maybe one quick moment?
Oh, I don't, guy's magic. I don't know what it is.
It took a while to diffuse the technology.
So I have a book out recently called Learning by Doing. And what it does is it looks at history to get some perspective on what's happening today. Because it turns out that what's happening today is eerily similar to what happened during the Industrial Revolution. At that time, for decades, they had stagnant wages, they had anemic productivity, measured productivity growth. And the reason, I argue in the book, is that technology is more than just the inventions. Major new technologies, such as mechanization during the 19th century or information technology, digital technology today, requires a huge amount of very detailed knowledge to be acquired by all sorts of people in the workforce. And there are huge institutional challenges to changing the way we acquire this knowledge, and there are huge costs to acquiring it. So I'm not going to talk any more about history, but I'll present some more recent evidence about how some similar factors seem to be at work today. And what I'm going to report are just some snippets from a new research paper that is, I think, the first comprehensive look at the effect of computers on detailed occupations. So I'll start with the straw man. A lot of people see technology automating work everywhere. The ATM machine has taken over work from bank tellers. We have e-commerce taking over work of salespeople. We have, even in white-collar professions, things like electronic discovery and lawsuits taking over work from lawyers and paralegals. And so the argument is these technologies are automating work that's being done, and it's causing technological unemployment, and people such as Eric Brynjolfsson and Andy McAfee and others see technology as a source for slow recovery from the recession, a low labor participation rate. Others see the effects more focused on mid-wage jobs or mid-skill jobs, and so they see job polarization, or the so-called hollowing out of the middle class. And so there is this paradox that Jim raised. Why doesn't this show up in the productivity statistics? If we're really doing the same work with fewer workers, we should see sharply higher productivity growth. The answer that comes out of this evidence about occupations is computers aren't actually replacing workers. The occupations that use computers actually grow substantially faster than occupations that don't. And that includes mid-wage occupations, it includes routine occupations, it includes the bank tellers, many of the white-collar occupations, but you're seeing nearly a 1% faster growth. And a more sophisticated statistical analysis can control for all sorts of things and influences, but the basic pattern holds true that automation is leading to more job growth in the last 30 years, this is 1980 to 2013, than a destruction of jobs. Well, how can that be? The basic answer is demand. When we automate things, we make the products cheaper, or we make the services provided by the occupation more efficient than other occupations, so we're seeing increased demand for those occupations. I'll give an example as bank tellers. So the dashed line over there shows the number of ATM machines installed, and it just exploded from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. During that same time period, the number of bank tellers actually increased. So we have nearly 500,000 ATM machines out there now, and since 2000, the number of bank tellers has been growing at 2% a year, which is faster than the labor force. Why? The ATM machine made it cheaper for a bank to open a branch office. They can compete more effectively with more branch offices, so they rapidly expanded the number of branch offices, and that offset the erstwhile decline in the number of bank tellers. It's not always like that in all occupations. So here, this graph shows the number of typographers and compositors, people who worked on linotype machines, which were replaced by desktop publishing in the 70s and 80s, and their numbers collapsed. But that's not the entire story either. Graphic designers took over much of their work. Graphic designers who use computers. And so we've actually seen an increasing in the number of graphic designers that more than offsets the decrease in typesetters. This is a case of substitution. The automation provides the graphic designers extra capabilities and makes them a more desirable, more economic means of producing type. So the question is, of course, what's happening in net? And when I run my analysis, the basic story is computer automation is creating just about as many jobs as it's destroying. The net effect is pretty much negligible. So the story about robots stealing our jobs is not true. You might describe it as, the issue isn't, the fear shouldn't be, a computer's going to take my job. It's another worker with a computer and specialized skills might take my job. That's a very different story with very different social implications. So this implies, though, still something of a paradox about productivity, because it implies that technology is not stagnant. Technology is having a dramatic impact on the workforce. It's just not the impact that some people think it is. And so we, presumably, even though we may not have lost a net number of employees, we've switched things around, and presumably firms are doing this because they're making more profits. And unless this is just business stealing activity, which there's no evidence to support, we would think that productivity should increase. Well, that might not be so simple because of the nature of this change. So there are two factors, I think, that implicit in this story, which have huge impacts potentially on productivity, and that we don't really know. So one is that a lot of skills go obsolete. The skills of those typographers are no longer valuable. Those people are taking early retirement, or they're taking lower wages, and that places a drag on our measures of productivity. At the same time, these transitions from occupations to one occupation to another, or changes within occupations, are imposing large learning costs. So those graphic designers have to learn a whole new set of skills. And one of the things is, with the churn of the technology, they have to learn a new set of skills every few years lately. So there's not only they're experiencing both obsolescence and learning costs, but those learning costs are something we don't really know how to measure. We don't have good measures in terms of output. Implicitly, they're creating new human capital. This is an output that's not being measured. We can get some clues about this. This chart shows the growth in the gap between the 90th and 50th percentiles within occupations. When computerizing occupations are seeing a much greater dispersion in wages between the top people and the median and lower portions of the workforce, all within the occupation. The reason for that is, I believe, learning costs. That, in other words, we're seeing the top 10% of workers are able to acquire the new skills. The median worker is not, or is not as effective at doing that. So the pay that's going to the top workers in computerizing occupations is rising much more rapidly, whereas the pay of the average worker is stagnant. We see other evidence of huge learning costs. We're seeing a lot of occupations employing more college graduates, or just upgrading the education level of their hirees. And this is true. The blue shows all occupations. The red shows occupations where college is not required. So even among bank tellers, you're seeing more college graduates being hired. And my interpretation of this is signs that they are looking to hire people who can learn new skills, not necessarily that they need a college degree to do the work, but their college grads may be more facile at learning new skills. So my two bits to add to the productivity puzzle is human capital and skills may be a huge elephant in the room. Thanks.
Okay. Now, John Fernald.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to start off a couple of things in your introduction, Jim. One is that, yes, in the past 40 years, productivity slowed, has been relatively modest, kind of 1.5% for most of that period, with one exception of the period from, say, 95 to 2003, when it was much faster. So that kind of raises the question, what's normal? And why is that normal, given all the innovation we think is going on? Now, one thing I have on here is I'm actually on leave from the Fed, so I'm visiting a think tank in Rome. So I agree that from the perspective of Europe, they would love to have a stagnant economy like ours. So the basic kind of hypothesis that I want to keep in mind is one that Greg Ip suggested in the Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago, which is about talking about that the productivity paradox, that the things at which Google and its peers excel, from internet search to mobile software, are changing how we work, play, and communicate, yet have little discernible macroeconomic impact. Transformative innovation really is happening on the internet. It's just not happening anywhere else. So what are the numbers that would support this view? And then, so I want to talk about that and a little bit about the role of IT in this, and then talk about how far measurement, in my view, can get us. So starting with just some facts about productivity growth, these bars show labor productivity growth, or output per hour, in the business sector for various periods going back to 1947. So, 47, which is when we have quarterly data to start. So 47 to 73, productivity growth was above 3% a year, 3.25% or something. It slowed in the 70s and 80s to about 1.5% a year. Then we got this brief, and so, but then in the past 2 decades, we've gotten this exceptional pace, this recovery to a fast 3% growth, and here labeled the third bar from the left, 95 to 2003. And then, unfortunately, after 2003, it's kind of disappeared. So I've broken the past dozen years into 3 bars. So the 4 years leading up to the Great Recession, then the periods are during the recession and the early recovery, and then the past 5 years. And the past 5 years have been the slowest productivity growth during an expansion that we've had in data going back to the 19th century. So it's pretty exceptionally weak productivity growth. But really, if you average over the past dozen years, 1.5% is what it's averaged, which is what we saw in the 70s and 80s. So maybe that's what normal is, and we have lots of innovation going on, and it adds up to something like 1.5% productivity growth. That's sort of where my conclusion is on that. Now, to get some more insight into why that happens, let me do some growth accounting to kind of say, what can we explain of this productivity growth? Now, there are clear economic reasons why we think businesses become more productive over time. So the top orange bar here shows the contribution of labor quality, or what the Bureau of Labor Statistics would call labor composition. Basically, this is the increases in the education and experience of the labor force. And so over time, we've gotten more educated. Neurosurgeons get paid more than plumbers, and that would get counted here as being more productive. Well, one of the things you see from this is that, in fact, during the Great Recession, a big reason, and right after, a big reason why productivity growth was so fast was because we were firing low-skilled workers. So that orange bar was adding almost a percentage point. So you wouldn't want to take that 2007 to 10 period as being normal, because that's not what you want. You don't want an economy where you're just firing all the low-skilled workers. Well, the green bar is what you get from giving people more tools, sort of more software, equipment, structures. So that's giving them more capital per worker. Well, that's varied over time. You see, again, and when you go to that Great Recession period and early recovery, not only were we firing lots of people, but the people who were left had a lot of capital to work with. So that also boosted the productivity numbers. So what's left in blue is total factor productivity, which is sort of a broad catch-all residual, but over long periods of time, it measures innovation. So if you look at that, then over the past dozen years, for each of these sub-periods, what we've seen is kind of around 0.5% on TFP growth. So one of the things you see in the past 5 years is we hired back some of the low-skilled workers, so labor quality added less, and we hired back so many people that capital deepening hasn't kept up. We've actually had capital shallowing. So that's also not going to be sustained. So I think what we've seen in the past 5 years overstates the weakness of the productivity numbers. So what I would prefer to do is to average over the past dozen years and say that's kind of my best guess of what's normal. So if I look at industry, so in order to understand before we get to thinking about, say, measurement, what we saw from the 2003 to the period since then is a slowdown of something like 1.25 to 1.5% in this blue bars of TFP or innovation. So that's what if we need mismeasurement to explain that, that's what we need to fill in. So it's a pretty big, big gap to try to explain. And so in looking at, I would also note in looking at industry data, the slowdown across industries is pretty broad-based. There's not like a clear smoking gun. It wasn't housing. It wasn't, just one or two sectors. It was a lot of sectors, although the slowdown was larger in kind of IT-intensive market services. So retail, for example, and wholesale, it was contributing enormously to productivity growth in the late 90s and early 2000s. A lot of work looked at the role of IT in that. And what you found is, and what those studies found is, Walmart and its competitors were much better, or similar firms were much better at organizing logistics and getting goods into the hands of consumers. Well, you also saw that the unproductive, mom and pops all disappeared from the data. Well, once that process was done, it's a reorganization facilitated by information technology. Well, what you're left with is ongoing incremental productivity growth. So you had a transformative period in retailing, and then it went back to something more normal. Now, looking forward, you don't know maybe you're going to get that again. You have some new great innovation and breakthrough that hits the entire economy, but it's very hard to predict that. So my best guess is we're going to get more of what we've seen in the past dozen years and really over the past 40 years. Now, the problem that, of course, was raised is this is the official statistics. So maybe we don't have a productivity problem. Maybe we have a measurement problem. So the kinds of concerns people have highlighted, especially focused on, are things like deflators for capital goods. I think Steve may talk more about that. We produce more specialized equipment rather than general purpose equipment. The careful quality adjustment there has not been done as much. So there are reasons to think maybe in capital goods we've gotten a little worse. The other thing people point to is free goods available on the internet, things like Facebook and Google, and things like online cat videos. So I get enormous benefit from watching online cat videos, and it doesn't show up in GDP. So maybe if you added those online cat videos, really we're still extraordinarily innovative. Well, I think that's right. There's a lot of benefit coming from all of these things. But conceptually, is it that much different than the fact that the way Gary Becker thought about a lot of the services we get is we buy some market goods and we combine it with our time in order to get what we ultimately want. We go to a restaurant, we pay for a restaurant, and then we spend our time there with our family. That's what we get. Or other things we do outside of the market. Spending time with our kids. That we value a lot. And the connections we get on Facebook are kind of like that. They're not market transactions. They're part of our non-market lives. So conceptually, I think what you want to do for that is think about a total economic account. It includes the market and also the non-market benefits. So Bill Nordhaus, for example, has argued for that. Dale Jorgensen has argued for expanding the accounts. So you could get a better and broader sense of all of our economic lives, not just our market lives. But I don't think the market-based innovation, that the mismeasurement helps us explain the market-based slowdown in technical change. That looks real. So it looks like in market activities, we have a productivity problem, if that's the right way to put it. So my takeaways is that modest productivity growth looks like the new normal. It's what we've gotten the past 40 years. We've gotten, we have maybe 1.5% productivity growth is consistent with all of this ongoing, very important and transformative innovation we're seeing. I don't think measure can explain it, and in some sense, maybe information technology is the reason we're doing as well as we're doing. And that's the resolution of the productivity puzzle. Now, the future is highly uncertain. We could get another great wave. But I will leave it at that, maybe for the following up conversation. Thank you.
Have Michael Ferroli next. Nothing happened.
All right, thanks, Jim. So my remarks are going to actually fit in with John's pretty closely. Actually, I want to focus a little more on what's been happening with investment in technology, equipment, and the reason I'm focusing on that is because that, productivity boom period that John spoke of, 95 to 2003. One thing we think we know about that period is that was driven largely by industries that were investing a lot in technology equipment in that period. And so I guess in a way, I'm not really focusing as much on the stagnation period, but on what drove the boom period and why that may not be present right now, and so why we could be reverting to a pre-95 type of productivity growth. The prism through which I want to discuss this is through thinking about investment-specific or embodied technical change, which captures, I think, the kind of common sense view that productivity gains happen when companies invest in new technology, and certainly that seemed to be the case in the 95 to 03 period. So the Walmarts of the world, productivity didn't just come to them as like manna from heaven, as they say, but rather they had to invest in new technologies, and then once they did, they were able to reap the gains in the form of higher productivity. Another aspect of this way of viewing productivity growth is that it implies that the price change for capital goods should be in a way inversely related to the level of technology embodied in newer vintages of capital equipment. So in other words, when prices for computers on a constant quality basis are falling rapidly, presumably this should be related to the quality increasing pretty rapidly in newer vintages of capital equipment. So what's been going on with prices for capital equipment? Well, the blue line here, if you can see this in the back, is the real relative to the GDP deflator price for information processing equipment in the GDP account. So this is computers, and primarily computers and communications equipment. What you can see there is that in the late 90s, real tech prices were falling at over a 10% pace per year. More recently, this has moved up to more like minus 2 or 3% recently. So the pace of declines in the price for capital equipment is not falling quite as rapidly, or nearly as rapidly as it was in the late 90s. Presumably, these declines made it reduce the cost of capital for information processing equipment in the late 90s, and what you got was a response by businesses investing a lot more in high-tech equipment. And what's probably even harder to see if you're in the back is the light green line here is the real growth in business spending on high-tech equipment, which in the late 90s was running oftentimes over 20% per year. As you can see, since the recession has been kind of puddling along in the low single digits. So presumably, if our analysis of the 95 to 03 period is correct, that boom in productivity was driven by a lot of investment in information technology by the Walmarts and others in the trade and other services industries. And if that investment is now slowing, presumably this should go a long way toward explaining why we aren't seeing the types of gains we did in that period, which is another way of kind of coming back to John's point about the capital deepening as being something we should kind of focus here on, thinking about the slowdown in productivity. Looking at this quite a similar but slightly different way, what I've plotted here is business spending on tech and non-tech equipment as a % of GDP. And you can see that non-tech investment which again is a little hard to see. I didn't realize this when I put these slides together, is that light green line. It's actually now above the peaks from the past business cycle. So I think it makes it kind of hard to argue that what's holding back spending here is some kind of animal spirits or hangover from the Great Recession, because it would be kind of an odd animal spirit that would cause businesses not to invest in tech, but to be, quite liberal in spending on non-tech equipment. Second thing I'd point out here is, as you can see, these are nominal numbers, nominal shares of spending in GDP. The spending on tech equipment is obviously, as a share of GDP, pretty low. And I think this is interesting because while there is a lot of debate about the measurement of the deflators, I think there's, at least in spending on tech equipment, less debate about the nominal dollars spent on tech equipment. And in the 90s, nominal dollars being spent on tech equipment was growing at a 7% annual rate per year. Since 2000, there has been zero growth in nominal dollars spent on tech equipment. So even if the deflators were exactly the same in the earlier period and the current period, you would have a 7% step down in the pace of real spending growth on tech equipment. My last slide is going to, I think, kind of segue in somewhat to what Steve's going to talk about, which is the measurement issues. And as John said, we haven't done all the work, the careful work we need to on measuring tech equipment prices correctly to account for quality changes. However, one of Steve's co-authors at the Fed, David Byrne, has incorporated at least some better measurement into the industrial production accounts at the Federal Reserve, in particular for two categories of tech equipment: communications equipment and computer storage devices. Dave's done, as he always does, very solid, thorough work. And what you can see, starting with the left-hand side, so let's just focus on the chart on the left-hand side. So there's a lot going on here. So what the blue lines are, or blue bars are, is growth in computer storage device production from 1990 to 2003. I chose 2003 because that's the break date that John's found for a lot of productivity data. And then the orange bar is since 2003. On the left-hand side is the pre-revised data. On the right-hand side is the data incorporating Dave's more thorough work on accurately measuring the prices. And what you can see is, you look at the orange line on the left, it is true that the growth of computer storage device production, when you do a better job accounting for the revisions, almost doubles. It's also the case that in the pre-2003 period, you see a pickup in the pace of production. And what's interesting, though, is that even if you're looking at the old or the more thorough deflators, you see a pretty significant step down in the pace of production growth in computer storage devices. And similarly, on the right-hand side, that's for communication equipment devices. Now, again, this is production. This is an investment, but production goes into how we measure investment in the accounts. And so I think, I definitely applaud the work that Dave's done. I don't, however, think it really changes qualitatively the view that, we've seen a significant step down in real investment in tech products, and that still, in my mind, likely is the most plausible explanation for why we've seen aggregate productivity growth slow. So, in conclusion, I think the facts, as I said, still seem to fit the story that slowing in tech investment at least goes a long way toward explaining the stagnation, or maybe put a different way, the lack of a revival of the boom from the 95 to 03 period. Measurement issues, as I said, I think the work that Dave Byrne is doing is just, starting that process, and they're definitely, I think we should invest a lot of resources in measuring these things correctly, but I don't think thus far they've qualitatively changed the story.
Great. Hey, thanks a lot, Mike. Steve, you're up.
Thanks very much. Okay. I'm just going to start out with my disclaimer. Anything I say is just my own personal view, and it's not an official position at AI or UCLA. I feel like I'm still at the Fed, actually. I was afraid before we started talking that John, Mike, and I were all going to say exactly the same thing. But actually, we're not. I think the measurement issues are more significant than the two of them believe. And my short presentation is going to be largely focused on that point. So I'm trying to answer three questions. The first is, what's the outlook for trend productivity growth? I know the people in the back can't see this, so I'm just going to try to read things. And as Mike and John have indicated, economists generally think that we're going to see some pickup in productivity growth from the really abysmal pace that we've seen over the past 5 years, but to something like 1.5%, maybe a little better in terms of annual growth in labor productivity, which is about the average for the past 40 or so years, but is below the longer-term average in the United States, which if you go back to the late 1800s, is more like 2.25%. So mediocre by the long-term historical standards. Now, on the question of how reliable those forecasts are, I'd say not reliable. And I'll talk about that a bit more in just a moment. And no disrespect to any of us, but economists are terrible at forecasting this. The second question is, do the official data suffer from serious measurement error? I think the answer is yes. Growth is definitely understated. That's been true for a long time. Exactly by how much, we don't know. And the third question, which is, I think, even harder to answer but more important, is, has the understatement of growth gotten worse in recent years? And I think my answer is yes. Again, it's unclear by how much, and a whole lot more research is necessary to answer that and should be a very high priority for the statistical agencies. So I'm going to really skip this slide. John did a great job of going through the historical record of productivity growth in the United States, the slow growth from the early 70s and the mid-90s, the decade of rapid growth that was largely traceable to information technology, the slowdown after 2004, which at least until recently is also largely traceable to information technology. And the last 5 years, as I mentioned, have been terrible. So in terms of forecasts, there's actually a pretty tight range of forecasts from most economists about trend labor productivity growth. They range from about 1.5%. John is not in my table, but I now know that he should be at 1.5%. Goldman Sachs is about 1.5%. Top end, the Congressional Budget Office is at about 2%. So it's a pretty tight range. It looks like we all believe the same thing. The fact is, though, I think this is just herding behavior, because in the face of massive uncertainty, everybody's reverting to what looks like has been the mean over the past 40 or so years. And just to amplify for a second on the point of the bad forecasting record, no economist to my knowledge actually predicted the massive pickup in productivity growth in the mid-90s. In fact, most of us were unaware of it until about 2000, when the data became sufficiently revised for it to be completely evident in the data. And similarly, the slowdown that began in 2004, most of us didn't really perceive that was happening until about 3 years later. So not only did we not predict, we didn't actually even know what was happening at the time. So now I'm going to transition to the points about measurement error. So this is a picture very similar to something that Mike put up with an additional line. The red line shows the price declines year by year in the national income accounts for computers and peripheral equipment. Low means rapid declines. Higher on the page means very little decline. And you can see in the mid-1990s through about 2000, there were very rapid declines in computer prices, which have now given way to a pattern of basically no decline anymore. The last point on the red line is at 0. The blue line is the official measure of what's happening to semiconductor prices, specifically microprocessor units that go into computers. They also fell very, very rapidly in the second half of the 1990s. And there's a nice coherence between these two lines, which, at least through the period of about 2000, I think is right, which is that there was a period of very intense innovation in the second half of the 1990s. Semiconductor prices fell a ton, and that got reflected in computer prices, which have a lot of semiconductor content. This picture makes it seem as though the innovation has faltered and paints, I think, a very negative picture. Now, the semiconductor price index that's generating the end of the blue line, the last half of the blue line, is from the producer price index that the BLS produces. Okay, so now all I've done is I've superimposed another line on the picture that you just saw, this dashed black line. This is another measure of semiconductor prices that comes out of research that I'm doing with David Byrne and Dan Sickle, where we've estimated hedonic price indices for microprocessors using essentially the same data that the BLS uses. And what you can see is that there's been very little, if any, slowdown as we measure it in the rate of price decline for semiconductors. So that then raises the question, if this black line is right, how can the red line be right? Because that rapid decline in semiconductor prices should be reflected in computer prices. Why are computer prices barely falling? I think the answer is they're probably not barely falling. This is one of the measurement error problems that I think is more significant than most people realize. So Dave Byrne, Dan, and I have put together a data set that has a lot of transactions data on laptops, desktops, tablet computers that's collected by a private company that gets scanner data. It's called the MPD Group. They collect data from large commercial outlets like Best Buy and Staples, not only the brick and mortar stores, but also the online sales. The data that we have go from 2007 to 2014. It has a lot of information about average transaction prices by model and many, many characteristics that allow you to run hedonic regressions. So what we've done so far is to run standard hedonic regressions where you have a lot of controls on the right-hand side for the characteristics of the models for the tablet computers that are in the sample. And there are about 2,000 separate models in the sample. It's very hard to see at the bottom, but the bottom line is these results show no slowing in the pace of price decline for this class of computers. From 2007 to 2010, we estimate the prices fell about 10% per year, and from 2010 to 2014, about 12% per year, so no slowing. In contrast, the BEA measure of prices for all personal computers, this is broader than tablets because they don't publish a tablet index, that also fell at 10% from 2007 to 2010, but only 3% for the more recent 4 years. So there's a gap that has opened up that I think is telling in terms of what we also find for semiconductor prices. This is my last slide. It's titled A Quick Tour Through Other IT Price Measurement Issues. And there are lots of them. So some of them actually were touched on by Mike. The first is communications equipment. Dave Byrne, as he mentioned at the Fed, has done a lot of work showing that BEA has underestimated the rate of price decline for telecommunications equipment going back at least to the mid-1980s, but the bias has gotten worse since 2010. Mike showed you a picture that aggregated the data from 2003 to 2014, but if you just look at the last 5 years, the bias has gotten a lot worse. Special purpose electronics. This is a category that we tend not to think of, but it's actually a lot larger in terms of domestic production than computers. This includes medical devices like CT scanners and a lot of military equipment like surveillance equipment. This stuff has as much semiconductor content as computers, but the producer price index that's used to deflate it shows no price decline at all. I think that's very implausible. Software. This is a much larger component of GDP than any of these equipment categories that we've been talking about in terms of domestic production. This is an area where, again, BEA shows no price decline at all for the over the past decade, which again seems very implausible given advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Telecommunications services, again, BEA's price indexes show no price decline over the past decade. This again seems implausible given how much you can do with a cell phone today compared to what you could have done even a couple years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. In quality adjusted terms, it's just not credible these prices are not falling. And finally, internet access. Again, BEA shows no price decline in quality adjusted terms for internet access since 2007. This has to be wrong. I mean, just think about how much information is now available to you on the internet. I'm not talking about posting cat pictures. I'm talking about using the internet for something productive that people are willing and do pay monthly fees. So this is not non-market stuff, free stuff. These are things that are captured by market transactions and that I think are not measured right. So I think measurement problems are big. How much they're going to change the picture of productivity growth, potential output, TFP relative to what we know now, I don't know. But we really do need to invest a lot of research, not only by the statistical agencies, but by researchers like us and many others in our profession to figure it out. Thanks.
Great. That was fantastic. I really appreciate it. And I'm wondering, at some point here, we are going to open it up to you folks. So think about any questions, brief, to the point questions that you might have. But before we get to that, I'd like to first maybe have a conversation here now that we've sort of heard everybody's views. Who's had their minds change, or who has had or questions for each other? Because certainly, as I say, certainly, everyone's being polite. Certainly, for instance, John and Mike, you have somewhat different perspective than Steve. Certainly, looking at depending on who might be more correct, you're looking at different growth rates, different productivity rates, maybe a different analysis on the current state of the economy. What do you think?
Well, I'm not all that sure that Steve and I are really that far apart, despite his attempts to exacerbate exacerbate the differences or highlight the differences. I mean, there's no question there's mismeasurement. There's any number of different ways we mismeasure quality, new goods, outlet substitution, substitution biases in general in price indices. Import prices versus domestic prices are a problem when you substitute that doesn't get measured right, and there are lots of other ways. The challenge, of course, here is, which of course Steve emphasized, is the problem has to have gotten worse. And it's not just because we have mismeasurement. Some cases it goes the other way. Some cases, but has the problem really gotten worse? You highlighted, of course, the area where your careful work has highlighted that it almost surely has gotten worse. But it's not a big share of GDP. So I think even if you count that, especially because it applies to imports as well as to domestic production of these things. So on the domestic production, it's not that big a share of GDP. So you multiply a lot of mismeasurement times a small share, and you end up with a couple of tenths. On most of what you were talking about is capital goods, not entirely. And on capital goods, that doesn't help you with the broad-based sort of total factor productivity measures. Because you also have more capital input, and if the mismeasurement of the import prices is along the same lines as what you're getting, and we're importing capital goods, then actually we're getting we're explaining the same output in other sectors with more capital and more tools. So it makes the broad-based TFP slowdown or innovation slowdown in the market sector look worse. Now, some of those issues may apply elsewhere. I mean, I think it's very hard to know. Do we have how quality change in many other areas has happened? But I at least haven't seen the evidence that broadly it's gotten worse.
Right.
Where you go?
Well, yeah. I mean, I was kind of going to echo John that I'm not sure that that the differences are that large between where I and Steve are. I mean, I guess to put it in one way, So I think you presented good evidence that relative to the 07-010 period, the prices in 10 to 14 have been mismeasured. And let's say computer prices are indeed falling 10 or 12% in that period. But my recollection of the computer data, at least in the capital side, was that those were falling 25 to 30% in the 90s. So I think even if I accept all your research that, in the last 10 years, they're falling 10% on average instead of 5%, you still have a pretty huge swing from where we were in the 90s. So I definitely am very open to the idea, and I think you and your co-authors have done really good work showing that there is a measurement issue that has been getting worse. But I think even doing careful work, you see a slowing in the price of decline, which coupled with the slowing in nominal spending, I think is still going to give you a pretty noticeable step down in real capital deepening and tech equipment. So I think even if I accept all your work, which I do, I still think the qualitative conclusion that you had a pretty big move down in real tech capital deepening still holds. And plus John's point about the fact that this just shifts, won't really change top line GDP, modulo the software part, but I think on the tech equipment part, my recollection is that in the late 90s, value added from tech equipment production was 1% of GDP, and now it's 0.2% of GDP. So, we're just not producing all that much stuff here. So it's just going to give you more real imports, I think, as well.
Right. So actually, I do agree with basically everything you guys just said. I mean, the measurement issues I think are very important. Correcting them, I don't think reproduces the late 1990s boom over the past several years. I think that's just not happening. I mean, you can see from a lot of data that even though innovation is not faltering, we're not in a boom period like we were in the second half of the 90s. So I'm not suggesting at all that I think true labor productivity growth is 3%. Perhaps the 0.5% that we've seen over the past 5 years is really like 1.5% on labor productivity. I think that is possible. That doesn't get us back above the 40-year average, but I think it does push against the extremely pessimistic view, kind of the Gordon view that innovation's faltering. I just think that that's not correct. So I guess one other thing I would say is that I think the measurement questions impinge and are relevant for a number of different issues. What's happening to total factor productivity, which is our best measure of innovation, is one important issue. But another is what's just happening to potential GDP and what's happening to inflation, which also will be mismeasured to the extent that the real output is mismeasured. The categories that I went through, some of them are capital goods that are heavily imported. They don't imply a lot for domestic production. But that's not true for software, which is $400 billion. That's not true for communication services and internet access, which is another $260 billion. A category that I didn't mention at all is research and development, which was added to the national accounts as a form of investment a few years ago. It's $300 billion. This is a place where the price deflator is actually rising. Seems a little bit funny that would be true in an activity that involves as much innovative activity as that. So I think it's not just small sectors of the economy that are affected by these measurement errors. I think it actually adds up to 5, 6, 8, 10% of GDP, depending on how broadly you cast the net. And we haven't even talked at all about some longstanding issues like measurement of healthcare prices, where, that dwarfs in terms of the GDP shares what we're talking about here. It's a longstanding issue, and in terms of getting potential output right and what the actual rate of inflation today is right is equally important.
James?
So let me make two comments. This takes nothing away from what anybody else has said, but there are still big measurement issues that have been around for a long time, and that is these human capital and organizational issues. So some studies find, for instance, that the organizational capital or human capital investments are 10 times as large as the hardware investments. So we have a lot banging around, number one. Number two, those don't necessarily correspond one-to-one with the hardware investments. So we can go back to the bank teller ATM technology. That was a technology that fits John's pattern. From 95 to 2005 was when all the investment was. We saw a clear increase in the number of transactions per teller. But what we're also seeing since that period is ongoing changes in the workforce of the banks. Implicitly, they're still upgrading their workforce. They're still changing things. You're seeing growing disparity between the 90th percentile and the 50th percentile, all of which is suggestive of ongoing human capital investments in terms of figuring out how to make the best use of this technology. That it may be a very long and sustained process. And while that process is going on, we may be seeing ongoing churn and technological obsolescence of lots of skills and lots of human capital. And I think that's sort of the bigger. This is not just sort of an issue of measurement, it's also an issue of understanding what might be going on. People tend to assume that the productivity statistics are a measure of technology. And what all of my historical analysis says is these two things, and it's true in the long run, but over decade-long or even a couple decade-long periods, they may be moving very differently, in part because as new technologies come along, technology may be moving at a nice rapid pace, but that's obsolescing skills regularly. It's requiring new investments in training and human capital. Those investments don't necessarily get picked up in the output measures. The obsolescence does get picked up. So, in any case, there's a real drag on productivity that may last for quite a long
John,
time.
those cat videos are not being put to optimal use. In time, we will learn how to do that.
They'll charge for that. Or the process of learning how to put that online is actually a valuable skill.
Right.
Your story is has a lot of intuitive resonance, and there is. And what's harder for me to square is the timing of whether it. Of course, a lot of work before before productivity slowed down was looking at the same thing and arguing maybe, so for example, the 1974 paper by Jeremy Greenwood and Mehmet Yurakoglu argued that in 1974 we saw productivity slow down and we saw the personal computer introduced, and those were not coincidences, that we saw the PC and businesses and individuals had to start learning how to use this new and emergent technology, and that took a while. So that story looked better, I thought, as of the late 90s when you got all of the gains from this. But that's a story that was arguing that that goes way back. And so could be that that this is an ongoing thing, and the learning just takes longer than we think. And conceptually, what you're suggesting, there's a lot of unmeasured, intangible investment and accumulation of skills that takes time. When people try to go out and measure intangibles, what Steve has done work on, and Corrado and Holton and Sickle, it doesn't show up, I think, in those measures as changing the timing that much. But I don't think most of what you're talking about is only some of that would be picked up in those numbers.
Yeah.
I guess I would just kind of echo what John was saying, not surprisingly. You mentioned Eric Brynjolfsson in your introduction, and some of the interesting firm-level stuff he did back in the late 90s and early 2000s showed that with a lag of about 3 to 7 years, I believe was the number he came up with, firms tend to see the maximum impact of productivity gains after investing in the measurable technology investments. And given what we've seen, with the investment, however you want to measure it, real or just even the nominal, it's been quite a while since we've seen really robust growth in tech investments. So, certainly there are lags, but it's been a while, and those lags I think are starting to look pretty stretched, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to think about technology as a one-time investment, though. I think that's a problem. People get computers, and people got their computers in the 70s, or more typically in the 80s, and the systems that they use those computers in have been changed and keep changing. So, again, an example I use is graphic designers. So, those typographers and graphic designers. So, you've had wave after wave of change. You had first desktop publishing came along, and the graphic designer replaced the typographer. And then you had the internet come along. So you had web designers replacing the skills of the print designers. And then you had the smartphone come along, replacing the skills of the web designers. And standards that were, Flash was a standard used 3 years ago, and it's obsolete today. So there's this constant churn, which is productivity destroying in the short run. And so while each installation might be a 3 to 7 year lag, we're seeing multiple waves that are, repeating the process over and over again. And we need, I'm not saying any definite conclusions. I don't know how large these things are. All I'm saying is it's an elephant in the room, and we really need to get our hands around it in some better way.
Right. So I agree completely with what Jim just said, and also with John and Mike about the importance of intangible capital. I mean, you can get an example of that by just looking at Amazon.com. It has a market value of equity of over $300 billion. But if you look at its balance sheet, the tangible capital that it has, including cash on hand, inventories, plant and equipment's about $50 billion. So there's a lot of organizational capital tied up in that company that we're not measuring in the national income accounts. We're not measuring that as investment activity. We're not measuring it as GDP. BEA has taken some steps to try to broaden the boundaries of what's included in the national accounts by including some forms of intangible capital. The first was software in the late 90s, and then adding research and development 2 or 3 years ago. But the stretching of the boundary, I think, is still pretty small compared to the range of innovative activity that we don't measure yet. And so I think this is another element of something that should be high on the research agenda.
As the panelists may know, Goldman Sachs has come out a series of reports looking at some of these productivity issues. They've looked at sort of the measurement issues with hardware. They've also had quite a bit to say about software measurement issues, which we haven't addressed quite as much. I mean, it's difficult to measure the difference between this video game from 10 years ago and its current iteration. And when they added all that together, they've tried to put a number that they came up with that perhaps we're measuring productivity enough that real GDP growth, instead of being 2%-ish, is maybe a little bit closer to 3%, which may not sound like a lot, but it actually is quite a bit year after year. And if you're looking at a 3% economy, in other words, the economy is growing more or less like it has since World War II versus kind of this downstep, slower growth economy, it really is a very different situation. To what extent do you think that is plausible, that perhaps we're actually missing growth by that much, that we're actually maybe more like a 3% economy rather than this sort of new normal 2% economy?
I think 3%, that could be at the upper bound of what's plausible. But 2.5%, so adding 0.5% to top line GDP, I think that's entirely plausible. But that's what the research needs to do, is to figure out this enormously wide range where people are putting out lots of numbers that are really just back of the envelope calculations, to tighten that up so that we have more information. How much of that flows through to total factor productivity? It's going to be much less. Exactly how much less, I don't know.
I mean, I think it's plausible. I just wonder if we did the same type of analysis for the 90s and 80s and 70s. Video games were getting better then, too. Would we just be adding 0.5% to the entire history?
Right, you don't think it's
and then you have the same step
growing
down?
gap. It's just sort of a steady sort of.
I think it's hard to say just by looking at what's happening over the past few years and doing the house-to-house combat, so to speak, of doing all the analysis going back decades.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's entirely plausible that we're missing a percentage point. But what's harder to say, what I'm much more skeptical about, is that we're missing a percentage point more than we were in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, when we were clearly, there was a ton of work in the 80s and 90s on all and 2000s on all of these measurement issues. And the Boskin Commission highlighted lots of areas of which their 0.5% on mismeasurement of inflation was, I think, by many people thought a lower bound. I think a lot of it was arguably much larger. Because variety, we had many more variety stores. It was much easier to get any product you wanted, it seemed. So there's all this literature in the 90s about mass customization, which we were talking about then, that wasn't measured in the statistics. And so all of the same things were going on then. What I don't like about the Goldman Sachs thing is they take the Brynjolfsson estimates for a narrow portion of what Brynjolfsson reports for the internet and add that to GDP. I don't think that's the right way to do it. That's not conceptually the market portion. I think that you want to put, it's important, it's economic activity, but you want to count that. You also want an offset that people are, in Eric Brynjolfsson's numbers, there are less services from television because people are substituting towards the internet.
Right. And I have a feeling that I hope that some of the crowd asked some questions about the which Jim's talking a bit about the robots taking our jobs. But I wanted to ask, so how can we do better? Perhaps we're not going to do the Robert Gordon, the end of economic growth, or at least the end of broadly shared economic growth. But how can we move? Let's assume that 1.5% is maybe is sort of kind of what economies like ours do. More would be better, I would think. Faster productivity growth, more innovation would be better. So what is sort of the potential, the realistic potential? I know, John, that you wrote a paper, which just me highlighting from is one of my all-time greatest blog posts as far as traffic, because I think you used the word singularity. So every tech sci-fi person was drawn to this blog post. Real economists talking about the singularity when we're going to have just super intelligent AIs and everything. So what is sort of the upper bound of it, what you think we can do as far as, because certainly a lot of presidential candidates talk about accelerating the economy, 4% growth, 5% growth. What can we do? What's realistic?
Well, Steve highlighted that we're the uncertainty. Now he suggested we're all hurting on the, but I don't think that's right. I think you're looking at the past 40 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, no matter how sophisticated your model, ultimately you're feeding into it the data, and the data kind of push you there. But statistically, it turns out not only is productivity not forecastable very well, but the confidence intervals around any forecast are enormous. So that Mark Watson at Princeton and his co-author sort of carefully did that, and you get for a 10-year projection, just looking at the data, you think that anywhere between 1% and 3% is kind of the reasonable. I think that was an 80% confidence interval, which means an enormous difference for our standard of living, which one we get. But that gets to the point, Steve's point, that we didn't predict what was going on in the mid 90s until we were 5 years into it. So I mean, I think that at the frontier, there's not there are things policies can do. Supporting broad education, supporting research, probably building and maintaining our infrastructure that are only going to help. But ultimately, it's kind of do businesses find? But it's a question of do businesses find ways to change how they do everything they do in the way that retailing changed in the 90s, and that's hard to predict. But relative to whatever's going on in terms of just our knowledge, what you want to do is make sure that you can best take advantage of it, and you stay close to that frontier. And so, in that regard, it's pretty clear there's a lot of uncertainty about which direction technology is going to go, and you need a flexible economy to take advantage of that. So you don't want a lot of artificial barriers. So I can expand on that, or the panel can.
Well, I know, Mike, you've talked a bit about the economy. I think you've called it, calcify. You've talked a bit about the decline in startups and job reallocation. Maybe you want to touch, or John, you can, anybody about some of the barriers and how we can, remove those barriers or at least lower them a bit.
I mean, first I would definitely echo Stephen John's point about forecasting, and everything I was trying to say here was about
We will be asking your GDP and straight.
it was a post-mortem rather than a forecast.
Yeah.
I do think there are some areas of policy improvement, but at least as I look at it, the prime reason for the slowdown we've had is not policy driven in nature. It's just, occasionally we get speed ups and slowdowns in the pace of technological advance. And it's very hard, I think, for policy to influence that. Now, I definitely support all of the kind of mom and apple pie things about training, infrastructure, all those. And I think what you're mentioning is that we have seen, I didn't talk about it today, some slowdown in firm churn, in the degree of startups and business shutdowns, and some of that does seem to be owing to regulatory barriers that could be streamlined and improved, occupational licensing, things like this. So certainly there are areas I think that policy could improve, but in terms of the big step down from the 95 to 03 period to the more current period, I don't see that primarily as driven by policy, so I'm not sure how much policy, we can always do better on policy, but I'm not sure that's what is driving what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I agree with what Mike and John said. I don't think the step down was primarily due to policy, but it would be helpful to have a policy environment that was actually supportive of growth to the extent possible. So all the things that they mentioned make a lot of sense. I would just add immigration reform would make a ton of sense to really welcome large numbers of immigrants with skills, not to have H-1B quotas that make it difficult for people to stay in the country after they've gotten an advanced degree here. We need a lot of younger people to support us as we get older, and having people with skills entering the country in large numbers would help a lot.
Yeah, I agree with the general tenor. I think from a historical perspective, if you think about technological churn being part of the reason, that's going to go on for a while, regardless of policy. But I think it's unfortunate in some policy areas we've moved in the wrong direction in the last 10 or 15 years. So occupational licensing is one where things have become much more restrictive. Employee mobility related to things like employee non-competes has become, most technical employees these days are subject to non-compete agreements, which can be a significant barrier to mobility and to learning. There's some evidence that patent litigation has reduced venture capital funding, particularly in software areas. I don't think any of these things are the main culprit for the slowdowns in the startups and the lower employee mobility, but to the extent that they could improve things rather than make things worse, I think it would be nice to see.
Anybody else? One point, and I'm sure someone may raise, but I'll jump to it. If we have rising inequality, and the fruits of all this growth and productivity growth, if we do all these things, we'll have fast growth. But if that's not flowing to the 99%, then sort of is there too much emphasis being placed on it? Let's crank up productivity growth. Let's crank up GDP growth. And if that's not, and maybe more emphasis should be on redistributing that growth. That's where our policy priorities need to be. And indeed, the name of this of our talk used Great Stagnation from the Tyler Cowen book, in which he certainly painted a future where you'd have a small sliver of the population with good jobs, rising wages, and everybody else would either not have a job, be on a basic income, or be playing a lot more video games, or be doing sort of stagnant wages, kind of high-touch sorts of jobs, valets and that kind of thing. So what about that aspect of it? Not just economic growth, but making sure that's distributed and people can find meaningful work in the future.
Some of my analysis about occupations is targeted to that question, and it turns out that it's the same the source of a lot of wage inequality, and I'm not talking about the 1%, I'm talking about, say, inequality between the 90th and the 50th percentiles, is coming from dealing with new technology and the difficulty of acquiring skills. So I had that chart up there about the growth, the computer-related growth in that that wage gap. That explains about 40% of the total growth in the 90-50 wage gap through the economy. So it's not, clearly technology is not the only thing contributing to any economic inequality, but it does suggest that if we can solve some of these problems about acquiring skills, and which may require a more stable technology, so there may be some long delays about it, that we're going to help solve the inequality problem, or at least a significant portion of it at the same time.
John, did you want?
Yeah, but I would say, I mean, having a larger pie can only help. But we may not have, we may have limited in what we can do. In saying we want a dynamic and flexible economy, because we don't know which direction technology is going to go, and we need, to allow people to learn that. There's a downside of that. There's a lot of there's a reason we have protections in place that turn out to be barriers, which is to protect people. And so figuring out ways to protect people without overly affecting their incentives or harming their incentives, and without protecting specific jobs is important. So the example of how not to do it is, I think, of Uber in Paris. So I was in Paris for 6 months in the spring, and in June there were protests by taxi drivers against Uber. Now, I've used Uber a lot. It was great. They would show up. I knew how much my taxi was going to cost, as opposed to having them show up and the meter had been turned on whenever the call came in. So, I want to go to the train station, and it turns out the meter shows up at 15 euros. And I didn't, before I've even gotten in the car. And so, the French reaction to the Uber protests were to, arrest a couple of Uber executives and kind of, and have the president go out and talk about the solidarity with the taxi drivers. So that's an example of protecting the jobs and the existing incumbents. That obviously is not a way to promote innovation. Meanwhile, the Uber drivers are mostly lower skilled workers who loved their jobs, and the flexibility they had to do that.
All right, I think we'll see if anybody have any questions, because we got about 15 minutes left. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we will bring a microphone over to you. I'll start with the gentleman directly in front of me, since he's directly in front of me.
I'm just going to combine a couple of points connecting yours, that whether productivity is understated or not, what is a fact from the political economy perspective is the dispersion of wages in a particular occupation that drives the resentment. To your point, that those with technology have a premium, if you will, as opposed to those without the technical education. Isn't it true that if everybody, hypothetically, we could give them the technical education, the premium would go down simply because there's a supply? So there's an issue of relative skills versus absolute level of human capital, and there's a difference there. Connected with that is Mr. Fernald's point about from 2010 to 2015, capital deepening is negative. That seems to coincide with the declining in the labor force participation as well. So you have both labor and capital on the downside. So if you increase automation and robotics, wouldn't that hasten the political problem caused by the dispersion inside a profession?
Just quickly on the numbers, the capital deepening was negative, but that's that's because we're bringing down the unemployment rate so fast. So employment and hours worked were actually rising very rapidly. So that's why that was so low. So we were actually getting a lot of employment growth. Hours worked were growing about 2% a year over that period, but capital was was slower to pick back up. But you're right, labor force participation was going off, but that was an offset that contributed to the further declines in the unemployment rate. But employment was going up very fast. Of course, it had dropped a lot from 2007 to 2010. So hiring back people was what was showing up there.
So you raised the distinction between the sort of within occupation change and the absolute change, which is related to the between occupation impact. And I just highlighted stuff here, but computerized. So the big change between occupations, which I was also showing, is that occupations that use computers are taking jobs away from occupations that don't. Occupations that use computers are in greater demand, and their wages are going up, even the median wage. So what you're seeing is the median wage of computerized occupations is going up. The 90th percentile in those occupations is going up even faster.
I'd say that there's a recent McKinsey report that looked at sort of not just jobs that can be automated, but activities within those jobs that found a very high percentage. So if a lot of what people do can be automated, is that good news? Because then they can do the higher value added part
I
of it?
think right now, in the long run, these things change. I think right now it is good news. People assume it's bad news, and I think that's the mistake. If you look economic history, textile technology was one of the key technologies of the Industrial Revolution. And for 100 years, the technology was automating things. Over the 19th century, 98% of the tasks of weavers was automated. But the number of weavers actually went up. Eventually, though, and the reason was, the price of cloth went down, people consumed a lot more cloth, increasing the total demand. Eventually, demand for cloth became satiated. It slowed down in the 20s and 30s, and there wasn't further growth. And since then, technology has tended to reduce jobs. But I think that's the key thing. It's a long process, and as long as the technology is providing some major new benefits that are in demand, automation's going to be a good thing.
Okay, more questions. I'm going to go straight back there. The gentleman, right, with the tie on, not the gentleman. Gentleman,
Thought there were a few other ties here, but appreciate it. Three very quick, short observation questions. One on the training and the education. I guess one might look at what's happened in manufacturing, where a lot of people lost jobs, and yet we're supposedly short on various skills that seem to be consistent with the story that Jim told. But I wonder whether a college education really captures necessarily that learning ability skill, or whether that isn't a very crude proxy that in effect discriminates against a lot of people in the labor market. Second, on the free goods, it seems to me to say that we don't pay for those cat videos and so on is overlooking the fact that we pay for the internet service, we pay for the device, we pay for the lights in the room. In the old days, you might have sat around the family in the living room. They had to pay for a musical instrument. They had to pay for maybe sheet music. They had to pay for fuel for their lamps. So unless there's something that one wants to say about the quality of that leisure time, I'm not sure that this is different from what we saw a long time ago, and more recently just with free TV. And then on the point about the hedonic evaluation of computers and other equipment, I think, Steve, you've probably explained this to me many times, and this isn't a relevant question, but I would just raise it for the record, and maybe you can clarify this. Are all of these improvements essential? I think we've seen in recent years, for example, at least anecdotally, that businesses don't find it necessary to replace their computers as soon as they previously had. Presumably, they don't need all these new applications, and they don't need the power that the new computers would provide. And probably the same thing holds with a lot of these other technological devices. So can you assure me that this is all taken into account in the methodology of the hedonic adjustment in theory?
Is it?
So maybe I'll start with Mike's third question. I mean, in theory, it is. If you're using market prices that reflect market transactions where people are reflecting their demand for goods in what they buy, then yes, it should be. The regressions that we run are adjacent period regressions, meaning that we don't estimate one regression over a 10-year period and assume that the marginal valuations that are placed on each of those characteristics is the same for 10 years. We allow it to change year by year to reflect the marginal valuations that people are expressing when they buy goods. So I think in theory, it's pretty much under control. It's okay. On the free goods issue, could I
Yeah.
say a couple things before we turn it over? I mean, I think you're right. I think free goods is not the right way to think about what we're getting by doing things on the internet. I mean, people pay a monthly fee to get internet access. I mean, I think in our household, we pay Verizon something like $400 a month to have 4 cell phones and fast FiOS and TV where you can get any movie you want.
Are you a pro gamer? Is that what you're doing?
I don't game at all. So there are market transactions here, and what you're buying with that $400 or whatever it is that you happen to pay is access to content. And that content has changed dramatically. So I think this is analyzable within a purely market connection of trying to quality adjust what it is you're getting for the amount of money you're paying every month. It's a hard problem. I'm not trying to discount how difficult this would be to do in principle, but I don't think that this is hard to conceive of what you'd want to do.
I'll answer then the first question. Yes, absolutely. College education and the skills needed to deal with technology are two very different things. My book is called Learning by Doing because I argue that skills learned on the job through experience are required to deal with new technologies. The schools can't keep up with the latest technologies, among other things. Nevertheless, broadly speaking, education tends to be correlated with an ability to learn new skills. So it helps explain one point, which is why occupations that don't require a college education are hiring more college grads. But I think that relationship is very loose, and it's just a loose correlation.
Okay, I want to go straight back. Right there. Anybody want to raise your hand? Greg?
Thanks. My question is for James Besson. You did a good job of explaining why these learning issues can explain differentials in wages and output within occupational groups. My question for you is, I'm a little unclear on how it might explain the aggregate weakness of output per worker more recently. Is your story that we're not measuring it correctly? For example, if human capital were treated the way we do R&D, for example, as investment goods, would that solve part of the problem? Or is it more of a lag story that we have to go through some extended period of creative destruction before the technology or the techniques settle down into some sort of standardization, and then you see the improvement in actual measured output?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would call that lag story, but I think both things are there. There's a churn story where new technology is coming along, making existing human capital prematurely obsolete. So people suffer, and that component does tend to be measured as lower wages. We're not seeing it as an effective technology necessarily, but it may explain what's going on. At the same time, there are learning costs. If somebody's learning on the job, they're going to perhaps be paid less. So we're seeing a lower wage. That opportunity cost that is a human capital investment in classical human capital economic theory. But it's an investment that we're not measuring. It should be in the national accounts be measured as output, but we have no way of measuring that output. So we're both mismeasuring output to some extent, and we're experiencing a destructive churn in human capital.
All right, I think we have time for one more question because I really need to end at a hard. You've been trying. So.
I will not question. I will not express my opinion.
Oh, we have a question. Does anybody have an actual question? I think we're just going to go with questions, not opinions today. Right over there.
If Steve Alliner is right in what we've seen recently, I'm sorry. If Steve Alliner is right in what we've seen recently is mostly mismeasurement, and that actually the underlying productivity growth is like 1.5% over the last 4 or 5 years when we've had this really abysmal. I mean, I'd be curious to know if Mike seemed to suggest he might agree with that, but if Mike and John do agree with that, if that's the case, what does that mean for inflation? It means inflation is lower, right? A lot lower than we've seen, doesn't it? And what are the implications of that?
Again, I think it comes back to the issue of if we're going to lower the inflation measurements recently, are we also lowering the inflation measurements in the 90s, 80s, 70s? And indeed, this was one of the reasons why arguably we have a 2% inflation goal, not a 0% inflation goal, is that there not only now but always has been this concern about mismeasurement.
Steve's position was that the last 4 years or so, or 5 years or so, where there were measurement errors, and that they seem to have gotten bigger over the last 4 years.
Do you feel that way for consumer prices?
I think for consumer prices, it's not clear that they've gotten worse, but their share, those components as a share of GDP have gotten larger in current dollar terms. So I do think that the measurement problems have had a more significant effect on GDP growth in the past 5 years than in the prior 5 years, but how many tenths more on GDP growth? I don't really know. This is why I'm stressing the need for a lot more research.
But and just the point you were just getting on consumer prices, of course, the Fed expresses its mandate in terms of the personal consumption expenditures deflator, and a lot of what Steve was talking about were investment prices. So the question is, how much of that is also missing from, how much is there more missing from consumer prices than there used to be? And that's hard to say.
11:30. I'm had to do a hard stop, so I'm going to thank our guests for to me has been a fantastic panel. Everybody for coming. Thank you.
Steve, when
That's a
you
good discussion.
when you made the point about Amazon's market cap, I was thinking about